One of the reasons that I knew that I needed to be making YouTube videos was because I knew I needed to tell this story. And that's probably part of the reason why it took me so long to start, and in part why I've been slow to make new videos, because I know that this is what I'm supposed to do. And part of it frightens me very much, because I haven't told this story to many people except very close friends, and even then, not all of them have heard the whole story from my side. I'm about 10 years removed or so from most of the events that I'm going to be talking about, and so I think that gives me a little bit more of a perspective now than if I were to try to tell the story like maybe a year or two after. As a note, I'm going to change some names. I mean, I guess the people who were involved will probably be able to figure out who's who, but just to try to keep some anonymity about this, because it's not about them, even the people who did things that were very awful. This is about me telling my story, and hopefully in the course of telling it, maybe it will help some people know where I'm coming from in various things, and at the very least, I'll be putting out the truth. So there's something to that. I can understand if you're not interested. I mean, I'm not going to necessarily do anything to pump up this story, but it is what it is. And if you do listen, if something's not clear, feel free to ask me questions. Maybe I'll make something. If there are questions or something, maybe I'll make an update or answer questions about it. But I'm going to try my best to be as thorough as possible, even though I'm not going to be doing this with notes. So I'm not going to guarantee that this is going to be strictly chronological, because I think I'd have to go back into various notes and emails and look at various kinds of things, and I don't really want to do that. I want to tell it as I remember it, and not try to get too bogged down in minute details, because it's going to be long as it is. The other thing to note before I start is that this story deals very much with a church that is a non-institutional Church of Christ. And if you're not a part of the non-institutional Church of Christ, some details are going to be very odd to you. Even if you're a part of a Christian denomination and you're very religious and everything, there are various quirks, let's say, to this particular group of which I'm still a part of. I guess spoiler warning. But I know that when I begin to explain some things that go on, especially on the inner workings of a church, and I'm going to hit certain things that might make sense to somebody who's within this particular religious tribe, but is not necessarily going to make sense unless you've been a part of it, or you've met or talked with somebody who's a part of it. And even at that point, even people who are in the Church of Christ might not know all the things that I'm going to be talking about, because I'm going to be talking about, in some sense, the inner workings of leadership within a church. And not everybody knows how the sausage is made. I certainly didn't know until I was a part of it. And so I'm going to do my best to try to not get bogged down in describing all of these things, but I know at the outset, because I've gone over this story, like how I would tell this story a million times in my head, I know that there are a lot of things that I'm not going to be able to get away with without trying to explain it. And now I'm also going to hit another point, is that people within the Church of Christ, especially in the non-institutional side, and I'm already like, that's already jargon right there. Like, what's that? And some people in the non-institutional Church of Christ have very strong feelings about how to talk about ourselves in relationship to the greater Christian world. And so some of my explanations, I already know at the outset, in order to try to make the explanations as brief as possible and to explain it in such a way that the majority of people listening would be able to follow along, I might run into problems with people in my tribe. And even using the term tribe, they might have a problem with. But I don't know how unavoidable that is. It's like, okay, if you're going to be mad at me, be mad at me, because what I'm about to explain and what I'm about to talk about, like, I've dealt with worse than you getting mad at me calling the Church of Christ a tribe or whatever. At this point, if you're going to get mad at me, I frankly, I mean, I do care, but I don't care all that much. I am what I am. I am where I am, and I've come to accept that, and that's how things are. So let me start a little bit with some background about how I grew up and how I ended up being a preacher. So I grew up in the Church of Christ. My parents both are not only members, but very particular devout members. Like, it's go every single service, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night. If there's special services, make special accommodations within our schedule to make every single possible special service that there could possibly be. Take the religion seriously. My parents are not, or never were, flaky in terms of religion, and they took it very seriously. They discussed it, they studied it, and that was the environment in which I grew up. And not only that, but both sides of my family, from my mother's side of the family and my father's side of the family, there are and were preachers in the Church of Christ. I had a grandfather on my mother's side who was a preacher. He's now retired. On my dad's side, I had a great-grandfather who was a preacher, and several of my uncles on both sides of my family. So brothers from my mom and dad's side of the family are or were preachers at some point as well. So I come from a family not only serious about their religion, but multiple generations within this group, and so serious that many of them have devoted their lives to preaching and proclaiming the gospel. So with that much, I don't know, family history and the normalcy of that, being a preacher, at least on some level, didn't seem like a inconceivable kind of career. Although I don't know that I really ever thought about it as a potential career, like growing up, like that was something that I wanted to do. In fact, the things that I wanted to do when I was little, like I wanted to draw and write a newspaper comic strip. I wanted to write novels. I wanted to be an artist. Those were the things that I tended to think about and dream about when I was little. But in this religious upbringing, I was taught to take my Bible very seriously. And one of the positive things about the Church of Christ is that there's a big emphasis on studying and learning your Bible. It's not always getting in deep, but at least knowing what happens and knowing even the Old Testament, the New Testament, all these various stories, depending on the preacher or the teachers or the group that you're in. This is another quirk of the Church of Christ, is that there isn't a central denominational headquarters that controls or dictates or regulates the various congregations on a congregational level. In fact, the churches of Christ are each individually autonomous. This is how they usually tend to describe themselves. So each group, even though there's a tremendous amount of unity between various Church of Christ groups and congregations, like if you move from one to the other, even across states or sometimes even like across the world, you'll find that there's a lot of commonality in terms of doctrine, in terms of understanding, in terms of practice and all this other stuff. But at the same time, there's congregational autonomy. And in practice, especially at least in the United States, it's different potentially in other places, but in practice, there really isn't a higher authority than the church authority in that particular congregation. Now, I could talk more about that, but I won't go into that, into like all the different potential variations of that. But so in part, what that does in this kind of congregational setting is that it means that the leadership within the congregation has to take their role very seriously, and that often leads to spending a lot of time in the Bible. Well, garbage truck is going by. Well, we'll see if we can splice some of this in. So, I guess if I can get back into my head, it's like there's a great emphasis on understanding, living by the Bible. In the Church of Christ, there are some. They would get very upset by the way that I'm going to describe this, but this is how I'm going to describe it. Creedal statements about having no creed but the Bible. And so in the churches of Christ, usually we try to base our doctrines, our practices off of the Bible and not other creedal statements that came later. Even if the creedal statements are very good, we try to stick to the Bible. So it's in that sticking to the Bible that at least the environment, if you grow up in it and you're around people that take it very seriously, you end up learning a whole lot about the Bible, and that's also how I lived and grew up. I was baptized at the age of 9, which is pretty young, but I was always an overachiever in some ways. I hit an atheist phase, and I drew away from the church when I went to college. I was 17, and I eventually made my way back to belief in God, belief in Jesus, and then kind of almost kicking and screaming, kind of the way that almost like C.S. Lewis describes his going away from atheism into deism and Christianity. I kind of resonated with that in some ways. Eventually, I came back to the Church of Christ and started taking it seriously. A lot of times, people talk about that kind of transition from if you grow up in the church. They talk about that transition as like, trash truck is now coming back up the street. Okay, now what was I talking about? Oh, a lot of times people talk about that transition that that can sometimes happen for people who grow up in a church environment, is that in many ways you were living out your parents' faith and you had to find your own faith. And I would describe that experience of that atheist, anti-church phase of mine as finding my own faith. But in part because I grew up in that structure, and once I came back around to participating within church structures now and fully believing in it myself, I took it very seriously. While I was in college, I participated as much as I possibly could. I taught kids classes. I taught some high school classes. I even had the opportunity to prepare and teach and preach some sermons. By the time, and that this is, over the course of several years, I even took some classes in terms of that were offered at the church that I was attending in sermon preparation and other various things. And in the back of my head, I thought, oh well, maybe after I retire, I'll become a preacher. And that is sometimes the career path that preachers within the churches of Christ go. They go and they have a career. They do the thing. They do stuff, and at some point, preaching becomes like a second career or a secondary career or something that they do on the side, or something that they do bivocationally. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. Like I saw the value in learning how to preach, how to put together a sermon. It's one of those things, when you do it, you realize that you learn a lot more than you could even possibly explain to other people. So there were like things in my head about like how valuable it was just to go through the experience, learn it, and do it. And so I saw that as a very valuable experience for me, regardless of whether I was going to be a preacher or not. And I don't know that I necessarily thought that I would be a preacher. I thought that I was going to go into something else or do something else. I got my degree in political science, and I got a minor in religious studies. And I mean, this has already gone on too long in terms of introduction, but I just got my minor in religious studies, mainly as an excuse to take as many classes as I could from Professor William Adler at NC State. He was a fantastic professor and really broadened my horizons for what study of the Bible could be in an academic sense and a literary sense and a historical sense. And it gave me, a lot of those classes were very intensive classes that were like 500 level classes that had people who were planning on going into seminary and people who were just as serious about studying or learning about religion or Christianity or the Bible. And they came from all sorts of different denominations, sometimes different religions. And it really challenged me to up my game in a sense, because a lot of times if you're inundated within one particular framework of thinking about the Bible, and the majority of your experiences are hearing straw man arguments about other positions in Bible classes where everybody obviously has the right opinion, and there isn't somebody there to adequately defend their position, you tend to start to think that, well, all of my positions are really good, and obviously everybody else is I don't know, stupid or something like that. But then when you come across people who can very excellently and articulately explain and demonstrate their various positions about things, and then also poke holes in the way that you think about things and the way that you've always considered things in ways that never come up. It makes you, at least for me, it was an experience where I seriously had to up my game, rethink things, potentially, and abandon certain beliefs, and maybe take more nuanced positions on things. So it was a wonderful experience. And even though it was, all of William Adler's classes were from a secular literary / historical perspective of how we talked about and studied the Bible. For me, it was very faith building, because after various after my atheist phase and dealing with a lot of issues about, can I trust this ancient source, and what does it really mean, and what does it mean to devote your life to it, getting really down into the nitty gritty, finding first century sources, Jewish and pagan and Christian sources, talking about the Christian fathers, talking about pagan and Jewish critics of Christianity, and looking at all sorts of other kinds of things along those lines, and then also hearing the perspective of various people who were conservative or liberal, who were Catholic or various flavors of Protestant or Mormon or Muslim, and just in that, I feel like I got a really good intensive religious education that I couldn't have got necessarily if I had gone to a seminary that was safe, that just was within my own particular religious group, or if I just had stayed in church and just learned everything in church. Like that was real world experience for me. So I haven't even gotten to any of the meat of what I'm planning on talking about, and I'm guessing that this is going to be very long, and I'm probably not going to be able to get through this all in one sitting. So I think I'm going to stop here because I'm kind of mentally exhausted right now talking about these various things. I'm going to stop this. I'm going to say this is part one of, I don't know how long of a series. This is just kind of, I guess, an introduction to some of the things that brought me up to prepare me to be a preacher. And so I guess I'll get into more of the specifics of how I fell into that job, and then get more into some of the other areas that I want to talk about. But we'll see if after finishing this and looking at this, if I even think that this is worth putting up. Maybe I'll have to redo it. I don't know. But I appreciate you, if you have been listening to this. I appreciate you listening. If you have any questions or comments, let me know in the comments below. And God bless you all. And until next time, I hope the peace of God goes with you. Bye.